Morning, everyone in Asia, and afternoon to those joining us from New Zealand and Australia. Today is the last of the afternoons at the Opera for the year, and perhaps no better topic to finish 2020 on than a table discussion on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. D&I is for many a polarising topic. Furthermore, those committed to embracing a progressive D&I policy in their organisation often struggle, while the mind and heart may be willing, knowing the exact actions to take sometimes is less obvious. To help us understand these issues related to D&I, OPRA has invited 7 experts for today's panel. Each of our esteemed guests will be representing a particular interest group, and we've prepared questions that aim to tackle the thornier issues around D&I for them to answer. The format for the panel discussion will be that the panelists will be given 5 general questions that they will each answer. Panelists will be given 2 specialist questions pertaining to the interest groups that they represent on the panel. Questions have been prepared and shared with panelists prior to the discussion. Given the breadth of topics we hope to cover, time will be tight, and my job, aside from asking the questions, will be to manage the time. If we have time, we will also be taking questions from the audience. I'll do my best to keep it to 90 minutes, but no promises. Before we begin, I do want to make clear that this is a family affair. Ben and Vino are current managers in their respective areas inside OPRA. OPRA partners with Ashley and Helen on specialist projects. Callum is a client, Cara is my cousin, and Paul is an ex-OPRA employee. But worry not. Being a family does not mean we need to hold anything back, as we embrace constructive dialogue and the knowledge that the love and respect is constant. So with the disclaimer out of the way, let us now begin. So, kia ora Cara, would you be kind enough to kick us off by introducing yourself and then giving us your thoughts on the first question for today, which is, what do diversity and inclusion mean for you? And what actions do you look for to indicate that organisations are actively pursuing a D&I policy that reflects the needs of the group that you are representing on the panel?
Tēnā koutou, kia ora, hi. Yes, my name is Cara Nepe-Apatu. I live in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I come from a bicultural family. My dad is Māori, Indigenous to New Zealand, and my mum is New Zealand European with Irish and German genealogy, Paul's cousin. I am a proud mother of 3 children, and I work at the New Zealand Treasury as a principal advisor, predominantly focused on policy and Māori cultural intelligence, strategy and engagement. And with the first question like this to kick off with, is just a great scene setter for what's to come. For me, quite simply, diversity and inclusion are really about respect and understanding. It's about acknowledging the uniqueness of people and groups and meaningfully including them. In terms of diversity and inclusion in organisations more broadly and somewhat universally, there are some soft and hard efforts that could be pursued, such as when walking into an organisation or visiting their website. Can you visually see representation of people and culture structurally and in the interior design? Can you see the people? Can you feel the culture? Can you hear the language? When you look around the room, are the people and the voices of those people represented? And yes, definitely. Is there even a strategy, a policy, a network, or an executive lead in place? There are many things that organisations can do, and it's not a singular act. One action won't cut it. It's a triple and approach, and then some more, and it needs to be ongoing. I think for any organisation, starting with understanding their people and the area they're based in and work within is important. Fundamental to organisations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, from my perspective, is having an understanding of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is one of our founding documents. It has it has played a major role in framing political relations between the New Zealand government and Māori as the Indigenous people. So if I walk into an organisation and hear or see reference to the treaty, I see Māori leadership and partnerships, and can also get a sense for how they embrace all cultures more generally, I think it's a really good sign.
Excellent. Thank you, Cara. Ben, over to you. Could you please introduce yourself and likewise answer the first question for today?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, great to connect with everyone today. My name is Ben Hainsworth. I'm the General Manager for OPRA Australia. My role is essentially leading a team across this very large country and a very diverse country. And yeah, primarily in terms of my delivery, I focus primarily on both the assessment of staff into organisations and the talent development of those staff. So today is a really relevant discussion. It's one that challenges me personally. It's one that excites me, and it is one that absolutely humbles me because I'm still on a journey personally of discovery and understanding. I think for me, and I'll probably learn a lot from my kids. So I'm going to reference my daughter, who's 6. And she asked a similar question around in relation to particularly racism recently. And I answered her question, and I'll answer it today in terms of diversity and inclusion in a way that made sense to her and actually made sense to me. And my response off the cuff was that diversity is like all the colours of a rainbow. Inclusion is how we use and how we paint the picture. I don't know if she understood that, but given that she's into unicorns and lots of colours, I thought it was a pretty simple response. I think for me, going into organisations, I think there are technical terms like systems, symbols and behaviours. But similar to Cara, it's looking at and feeling that culture. It's understanding that from a organisational perspective, that we are recruiting, we're supporting, we're developing, and we're promoting difference. And I think that requires thoughtful, authentic and sustainable consideration. And it's not the approach of just getting the same. And that's my response to a reasonably complex question. Thanks, Paul.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Thank you very much. And yeah, they will be complex questions, and I appreciate you keeping it succinct and keeping it to time. Thanks a lot. Dr. Wood, again, could you introduce yourself, and could you also tell us who you're representing today on the panel?
Kia ora koutou katoa. So my name's Paul, and I'm representing those from a lower socioeconomic background. I grew up in a lower socioeconomic background. I've spent a lot of time around people who didn't have the same opportunities as those who, by virtue of the fortune of their birth, ended up with greater levels of education, greater opportunity, and greater success in terms of standard success factors in life. I followed a fairly consistent pathway for a lot of people in my area, which was to drop out of school pretty early and end up in prison. One of the benefits of that is I already knew quite a few of the people who I ended up in prison with because I'd grown up with them. And I was someone who was incredibly fortunate in the sense that I had the opportunity to turn my life around. And part of that is that I came from a family background that wasn't really as representative of other people in my area as it could have been, and I had lots of opportunity that others didn't get. So I'm speaking on behalf of that group today, and I do quite a bit of work these days with people who are in the prison environment who want to turn their lives around, but just don't have the good fortune of the support I had. So I work trying to make that more systemic for them, but that's the pro bono stuff I do. My background's in an area of psychology that looks at how we differ from each other as individuals and how we can understand those differences to find our path up the leadership and life mountain. Is that enough of an intro?
It's a good intro. So then, just given that, and in a short sentence, what does diversity and inclusion mean for you?
Well, diversity means that we have space for people who look, act, speak, and behave differently with different backgrounds. I actually think that's the easy one in many respects, Paul. You know, that's the, do we look different? It's the inclusion piece that's the challenge. And that's where we really tolerate, encourage, and respect those sorts of differences. And for me, for the group I'm representing, I think a big thing that I see in organizations is that there are visible differences and that people are actually nudged to bring who they are to work. For example, you know, we've got some great examples in New Zealand. Spark is one where if you've got tattoos, you're encouraged to show those tattoos. So I think that's a great example of inclusion. But also as well, it's organizations where some of the sacred cows that act as barriers that stop people from getting entry into professional environments have been slayed. And I'm sure I'll get a chance to talk more about that later.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Much appreciated. Callum, on to you. So if you could introduce yourself and then answer the question on the screen, that'd be great.
Sure thing. Thanks, Paul. Hello all. Indeed, my name is Callum and I have a background in HR. So I've been working in and around organisational development for about 20 years. And I'm here today representing, I guess, the neurodiverse cohorts within workplaces. And so they're people with, essentially people who have been born with a brain that's wired slightly different from the norm. Those with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc. They're the sort of the big three, but there's a whole lot of others. And what diversity and inclusion, I guess, means for me in an organisational context is that organisations, they exist to perform, right? And so D&I for me is finding ways to get things done effectively by ensuring that we're harnessing that power and the potential that comes from seeking out different views, different perspectives and experiences that people bring. Now, a lot of that is hidden, especially neurodiversity. It's seen through some behaviours, and we stereotype and pigeonhole people because of how they show up and behave and act, etc. But that's not necessarily all that they're able to do, right? And I think my work now around HR and helping executives and managers to think differently and to bring different perspectives into, well, I guess, discussions around the table is that we need to break down, and I love the word Paul used, sort of slay. I like the idea of slaying the management mechanisms that hold people back and prevent people from being who they actually are. Because if we look at that employee life cycle, there's a whole lot of stuff in there from a neurotypical or a normal, what's expected frame of reference, and a lot of people who are neurodiverse, none of that works for them, and yet they have skills and talents and gifts and superpowers that the organisation or that the workplace can really thrive and flourish if only they come out. So that's my mission, and I think diversity and inclusion and the indications that that's being done meaningfully is when people are asking those questions. Managers are seeking out different perspectives and allowing people to be who they actually are in a way that enables them to bring the best version of themselves. So that's my summary of what I think D&I actually is. It's enabling the unseen to come out in people. How's that?
Very good, very good. Thank you. On to Helen. Sorry that I'm moving it along so quickly. There's some really good questions coming, and we'll just keep it going. So, Helen, the floor is yours.
Fantastic, thank you. So, hi everybody. My name is Helen Duce. I English, live in Singapore with my husband and 4 children. I've been living here for nearly 9 years now. I run a consultancy called Include, which is a diversity and inclusion consultancy working with multinational companies to try and persuade, encourage, drag them to think about specifically gender diversity and thinking about gender diversity in a way that goes beyond just looking at women and thinks about men as well. A lot of the work on gender is all about women and doesn't look at doesn't include men, so hence the term Include. I also am the executive consultant to INSEAD's gender initiative. INSEAD is a global business school that has a base in Singapore. I represent a diversity and inclusion consultancy called Symetra across Southeast Asia. And I founded and still run Lean In Singapore, which is a global movement, which is encouraging women to start or join small peer-to-peer groups to help them address unconscious bias in the workplace and to support and encourage each other to succeed in however they choose to define what success is for them. So that's who I am. What does diversity and inclusion mean to me? So I was tempted to sort of go and drag out one of my definitions that I use when I'm training people on diversity, and I thought, actually, why don't I just think about what it actually means to me rather than what the book definition is. And for me, it's really about changing our workplaces so that anyone and everyone can thrive and have an equal chance of success. And that to me sort of brings the diversity and inclusion part together. It's not just about representation for the sake of representation, but it's saying, let's give everyone a fair shot, which may mean that we don't treat everyone equal. We might have to treat them differently to give them a fair shot, but that anyone can thrive. And it's really about those workplaces reflecting the communities or the countries in which they work, in which they serve. It should look like what it looks like when you step out the door. It shouldn't look any different. So that is what it means to me. When it comes to looking at the actions of companies, especially in the area of gender, what I look for are companies who are moving beyond this idea of it's just about fixing the women. This sort of idea that, oh, we'd have better gender representation if we could just train women more or teach women to behave more like men or whatever it might be. So those companies who are focused on fixing the women as opposed to including men, and it's companies who recognize that the workplace was designed for a 1950s man that doesn't exist anymore, and current workplaces don't serve men or women well. It's not, very few men have got a stay-at-home wife who takes care of the laundry and the kids so they can go to work unencumbered with any responsibilities, and nor do many men want that. Many men want to play an active role in the home and as parents. And so it's really about those companies who recognize that they need to change the workplace for everybody so that it fits with our modern requirements about how we want work to be and how we want life to be. And beyond that, it's companies who are really looking at things holistically, so that they recognize that they need to look at this at an individual level, an interpersonal level, and an organizational level, and not just sort of quick fix band-aids, on single siloed programs that have been proven not to work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helen. Ashley, over to you. So again, if you could introduce yourself and answer the question.
Yeah, g'day everyone. My name's Ashley Gordon. Born out west in New South Wales on Kamilaroi country. I want to acknowledge, before I begin, the traditional owners of our land that we all meet, and pay respects to our elders past and present. My role at the moment is General Manager of New South Wales Aboriginal Safe Gambling Service. But before that, I also did some research in Aboriginal communities around help seeking and barriers for why Aboriginal people aren't coming forward around health and obviously well-being. For me, I'd like to say what everyone else said. Cara, you were great to open us off. I appreciate what you said, but for me, it's about recognising the strength and capability of Aboriginal people in particular. That's a group obviously I wish to talk about. And inclusion in the workplace, I look at cultural safety, which is being able to be who you are, bringing your best self, your identity to the work, and policy to be authentic and genuine. I heard it said earlier too about we can write things up and they look flash and we can promote reconciliation action plans and whatever, but are they really genuine? Do they filter down? So the tokenistic as a history in Australia, and we need to move on from that. And that needs to be a real commitment to change. I also think inclusion is involving not just in the workplace, but the community. We're big on community in our culture. So if there's a business that's looking to achieve real results, we've got to work with community, work with family, work with traditional owners, work with elders, work with different family groups. There's more than just the people you work with. I think it's a community it takes a community, you know, to change things, and that's what we have to do. So to me, that's what inclusion means to me.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you, Ashley. Vino, on to you. Lucky last.
Hi, lucky last. So my name is Vino. I'm based in New Zealand. And my lens today is about race and ethnicity, but I just want to say that in no way do I claim that I represent the voices or experiences of this massive variety of people. I do bring my own lens, and my own lens is that of being an organizational psychologist, of being an OD practitioner, of being a coach, of having a long history of working with diversity and inclusion, of working in community development, very much about empowerment principles and how it feeds into diversity and inclusion. And for me, I'm really interested in, I've worked in Africa, Asia, Asia Pacific, and every time I think I'm getting ahead of this game, I realize I'm not. And I think that's a good place to be. It's because it's a never-ending journey. What does it mean for me? Mostly more aspirational, I think, and wider. I think it's about our sense of humanity, our sense of purpose, our sense of community, and our sense of belonging. And for me, it's living to this wider, higher ideal, if you like, that the work in the space is feeding that, and that we're making a real difference in that space. For me, as a psychologist, you know, how does it feed into what I'm doing? I talk about individual differences, we talk about personality, but what about individual differences in how we encapsulate and capture uniqueness and differences of people and embrace that rather than just examine it or analyze it? And I think for me, the work in the diversity and inclusion space, especially about race and ethnicity, is about the greater societal implications that we have and responsibility that we have. So it might be higher aspirational, but that's where I see it feeds my soul when I think of it from that angle. What does it mean for me in terms of looking at organizations who are pursuing D&I? I'd like to start off with, I look for organizations that have a healthy discontent for what they're doing. And I hope they continue to have a healthy discontent for what they're doing in the space of diversity and inclusion. I'd love for them to be able to know that the game is never finished. I'd love for those organizations to be able to have conversations about power and privilege and be comfortable about talking about that. I'd love for them to be able to talk about system-wide changes, but also culture changes, not just about going past the surface to a deeper appreciation of what we could be doing in the space. It's also about looking at our biases, and especially our affinity biases. We gear to be to favor people who are similar to us, but what are we doing about that in-group and out-group? And it's especially impactful for me because I know research says that we're more empathic towards people from our own in-group, and we are less tolerant of the pain of others from the out-group. And that's quite significant for me. And I would love for organizations to be able to encapsulate that in their thinking from the psychology and the diversity of psychology as well. And so, yeah, in a nutshell, it's about recognizing that there's opportunities around the neuroscience, around motivation and opportunity for change in this area. And that's what I'm passionate about.
You guys have really got us off to a great start. Now I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm wondering whether to go to the specialist questions now, but let's do a quick fire on these next two first. So Ben, can you kick us off here? We just want a quick fire synopsis of what do you see as the biggest gaps between the ideal of diversity and inclusion and the reality? I think you answered some of this as a panel, but if you could just add to that very quickly, that would be great. Ben, can you kick us off?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think in a nutshell, it's that everyone is equal and that we should all be treated the same. We're all on the same playing field. From a recruitment perspective, from a psychologist perspective, I think the biggest gap, therefore, is awareness and education. I had a client last week say that they would treat the entire shortlist of candidates for a role equally and not give due consideration to differences. So to me, in this country, being Australia, where 97% of organisations are less than or equal to 5 people, 97% of all organisations in Australia are very, very small. Having greater awareness and education for every organisation, not just your national and multinational organisations, I think is critical.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Paul Wood.
All right, well, I mean, the obvious skepticism is the one I mentioned earlier, where even if organisations are doing the diversity piece, making an effort to get people who look different, they then expect everyone to act exactly the same. And so they don't actually include those differences. And it goes back to Ashley's comment around the sort of tokenism. Well, if I can get a Māori here, you know, and we can do a karakia, then, you know, we're all sorted. But actually, you better follow the process and behave in line with what everyone else does here. So that's the big gap. I suppose for the group I represent as well, the problem is that, you know, there's not even the desire for the diversity in terms of background and experience. And there's certainly no inclusion in respect of some of the differences which pigeonhole you in terms of social class within New Zealand, which is even such an egalitarian society, still very much exists. And I'll talk more about that later. But again, the big gap, the inclusiveness, but even if you are doing the diversity, but.
Great. Cheers, mate. Callum?
Yeah, for me, I'm not sure if it's the gap or the cause of the gap, but I think it is that tokenism that a few have already raised. But so if D&I is about representation of society, or if, at the very least, your customer base, doing so tokenistically is a real issue. But what we tend to do is, like, D&I issues are made to be a project. So we look to have some sort of financial incentive or ease of implementation, return on investment, least cost, whatever it is, which means that we create D&I initiatives as projects, and we expect them to operate the same way as most other projects, rather than doing them because they're the right thing to do. And so we have to justify ourselves, or executives are looking for the return on that. And the flip side of that, for say neurodiversity, when you need to include people who are neurodiverse, there might be some accommodations that you need to make in the workplace, or the way work happens, or your expectations around what you need people to do. And those accommodations are always thought to come at a cost, but actually they don't, because the benefit of harnessing people to reach their potential comes at greater performance. And so it's this mismatch between what we expect from the project and what we expect from the people, if that makes sense.
I think it's well expressed, and I think that topics we're really going to get into today. So thank you, Helen.
So totally agree with everything everybody else has said. I think two things. One is this idea of tokenism, as in they see representation as an end in and of itself, rather than a means to an end, which should be about diversity of thought for creativity, innovation, better organizational performance. So I agree with that. And then my pet peeve in terms of the gap is just a lack of evidence-based solutions. Just a lot of mumbo jumbo opinion and assumptions, lack of data, and lack of solutions that have been proven to work. So a heavy investment in solutions that have actually been shown not to work. So yeah, I'll leave it at that because you need to save on time. I could go on forever, but I won't.
Brilliant, Helen, and you'll have more time when you get onto your specialist ones. Thank you very much. Ashley.
In Australia, I believe there's a bit of a reluctance to learn about other people's culture. I think for me, the more we know about someone's culture, the more we can understand and accept. And obviously, you know, this bit of going to work and someone telling you we're going to treat everybody the same, I actually don't believe in, because you've got to learn more about the people you're going to work with. So the more we can understand, and because I think if we don't do that, that cultural blindness comes into play, where, you know, what people have grown up understanding is right and wrong, and their values are true and correct, come into play, and, you know, they could be causing a lot of issues, because that's where racism and stereotyping people comes from. So the more we can learn about our other people's culture, the more, you know, accepting and obviously the more we can work more productively together. And I think some people find that working with disadvantaged people, they're going to require more work, and therefore they can be a bit lazy. You know, they can say, oh, I'm not going to take this individual on because it's going to take more time for me. But, you know, and then they're the stereotypes and the issues I see all the time, where organisations can be too lazy when working with disadvantaged people or people that might come with more complexity.
Thank you, Ashley, and just listening to you guys, it is such a privilege to be here, just listening to all of these views coming through, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the specialist questions. You know, where you'll get to go into some of these in a little bit more detail. Cara, what do you see as the biggest gaps?
It's hard when diversity and inclusion is still considered by some organisations as representing the others, or seen as a nice to have and discretional, when in fact it could be the much needed enhancement, solution and strength to an organisation, its people and the community, in short.
Brilliant, thank you. Vino.
Okay, so I'll start with my pet peeve is what I call adjunct thinking versus inception thinking about diversity. It's the aftermarket additions that we add to diversity at the tail end of meetings or the tail end of conversations. That is my pet peeve. And why I call this is adjunct is that we add on rather than thinking about diversity at inception, which is diversity at the onset. And I think there's just a radical mindset shift that needs to occur, which prevents the ideal and the reality from being so fragmented. Another issue is that the dressing that we add, I think of it as a cake. We've got multicolored sprinkles on the top of the cake, on top of the frosting, but when you cut into that cake, it's one flavor, you know, so we really need to start thinking about this a little bit differently. And I also think about the challenges of complacency when we give things the rainbow tick and think we're okay. I'm just running off my head of some of the stuff, but definitely for me, it's also around the spouse and enacted values of organization. What we say we want to do, but what we actually enact and physically and practically do is very far removed from each other, in a nutshell.
Brilliant, thank you, Vino. I'm going to go back the other way now, so I'm going to start with you, Vino, on question 3. And again, if we can make this quick fire, because after this we'll get into the specialist questions. So sure. We'll be going the opposite direction. So what practices, if any, would you like to see mandated to improve inclusion in the workplace? And do you believe that a meritocratic process of selection needs to be balanced with the needs of other drivers?
Cool. I think Helen referred to it earlier. I think the monitoring, but defining what progress looks like. It's incredible how companies have not defined what progress actually looks like and can't measure it. And what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So I think that has to be changed. I think the concept of multiculturalism, but demonstrated multiculturalism. And also a frustration of mine is that both academia and industry, we try to solve motivational problems with purely training solutions. And that's not the way to do it, because it's not about what people know, but why do they want to do it. One's a training issue, one's a motivational issue, but we actually assign the same blanket over everything. I think there's also needs to be less emphasis on culture fit and rather cultural addition. And I think that conceptually needs to change. I think it's about amplifying the voice of people who don't have their voice represented. And also, I think it needs to be positive draws. We keep talking about threats and consequences, but I think there needs to be other ways that we actually draw people into this conversation that's more constructive and more positive. Your last question about you know, how is it balanced with needs of others? I think it's easy to take the stance of merit when you're standing on the legs of privilege. And I think that's really important to recognize because it's almost like a Pollyanna assumption that all things are fair and equal. And we all know this world doesn't exist like that. As much as I'd love it to be that way, it doesn't exist like that. It has numerous wobbly foundation, wobbly legs, if you like, systemic, institutional, societal, economic, political. You can't ignore bringing that into the equation. Thanks.
You've kicked it off well. Okay, Cara.
To follow that, these are great questions, and my answer is yes. In many organisations, we have highly intellectual, high IQ, where the technical and clinical side is important, but for me, it's not enough. Some of these high IQs have some soft skills, a medium level of EQ, emotional intelligence, but very much lacking in cultural intelligence, so low CQ. I think seeking a better balance of IQ, EQ and CQ is needed. With respect to your first question around what I would like to see mandated, for me in the context of New Zealand, fundamentals start with understanding the history of New Zealand, having a good understanding of the Treaty of Waitangi, and having the opportunity to be amongst the people. I do believe that we have a culture of a bit of a ivory tower going on with our big organisations, and we kind of tend to lose sight of our people and focus narrowly on what's in front of us, which causes a huge risk when creating nationwide policies and initiatives. But to be really honest, inclusion really starts with knowing your own people and being able to do the simplest things, sometimes like pronouncing their names properly.
Couldn't agree more. And that's again, you know, the fact that you guys are starting to walk into some of those areas of controversy, I think is really powerful, and we're going to keep pushing that today. So thank you, Cara, and keep up the honesty. So Ashley, over to you.
I agree with everyone again. For me, all this has to start early. We can't start all these policies and often, you know, the dream when we get adults and get in the workplace. So for me, this inclusivity and working with disadvantaged Aboriginal people need to start, you know, young. It's in primary school, it's in high school. It's a cultural shift, a cultural change, and it's going to be really difficult if we wait till they become adults before we do anything serious. So to me, Australia has to change the way we do things, you know, as young people and youth. But on the question also, I do think there's an importance around recognising Aboriginal people's capabilities. Like we said, that cultural intelligence, that knowledge that we bring to the table for any organisation, not just an Aboriginal specific role, but, you know, into an organisation. Now, we've learned to walk in two worlds. We're a very resilient population, but, you know, where does people go to learn about community consultation, you know, building relationships with stakeholders? Well, I'd imagine that'd be a great asset and skill for Aboriginal people to have. So I think recognising their true capabilities, their strengths, you know, their ability to communicate with their own population, their own mob, is going to add value to any organisation. But, you know, we look at the capabilities that you require for a job, usually cultural intelligence and cultural knowledge, cultural relationships, and, you know, aren't a part of it. And I think the quicker we can do that, you know, the more we will see true value in the workplace.
Thank you, Ashley, and you know, I think that you guys are contributing to that education by being on this panel. So once again, you know, thank you so much. Helen.
Yes, so mandate is pretty easy for me. I think this is about mandating those proven strategies. So not just the sort of, you know, ones that have come through empirical research, but ones where there's been proper randomized control trials and it's been shown in a real world setting to work. Why wouldn't you mandate it if you know that it works? So we know when it comes to gender and addressing the pay gap, you know, if you force companies to share what the salary bandwidth is, the top and the bottom, and make it clear that negotiation is expected, that can go a long way to reducing the pay gap. Flexible working policies as a right, not as a benefit. Flexible working policies for all. And then equal parental leave, you know, and then there's a bunch more of things that has been shown consistently that these work. So why wouldn't you just say, look, everybody just do it? I think I prefer that more than targets, but I think mandating those things will go a long way. And then when it comes to meritocracy, I mean, so alarm bells go off for me when I get this a lot in the conversations I have. Well, you know, we do want to hire more women, but you know, we've got to make sure that they're as good as the men. You know, this is about meritocracy. We hire here on performance. And you know, there's very solid research that shows that when managers believe that they're making merit-based decisions, they're actually more likely to be making biased decisions than when they're not. So when a company espouses a value of merit-based decisions, and when managers reflect on that and say, I'm making decisions on merit, they're more likely to be biased because they're not checking their assumptions along the way. They're not managing for that bias, unknowingly biased, not consciously biased. So anytime people start banging on about meritocracy, I'm like, whoa, hang on a minute. And then the other thing is, it's building a little bit on Kara's point, which I totally agree with, is that, and there's evidence. So the work by Professor Scott Page, he spent 8 years looking at teams and what makes teams succeed on very specific and measurable tasks. And he, after 8 years of study, he came up with this theorem, this scientific theorem, that diversity, a diverse mixed ability team will outperform a high ability team pretty much every time. On complex tasks, pretty much every time, a mixed ability diverse team will outperform an expert team because of the diversity of thought. Because what it takes one expert to be great, they share the same mental toolkit, but in a mixed ability group, you've got the IQ, the CQ, the EQ, you bring all that together and it is been shown that you get better outcomes. So I always say, of course, you hire, somebody has to have the technical skills to do the job, and you hire the person for the position, but 90% of all the work we do these days is in teams. And you hire first for the position, and then secondly for bringing diversity of thought into that team, because that diversity of thought will give you better outcomes. And you know, people are, most organizations I work at, profit organizations, they're self-serving. You know, their purpose is to deliver, you know, shareholder value, more money. And so I spend a lot of time linking what we do to outcomes, to this is going to be a way that you're going to get better creativity, better innovation, better performance. And the way to do that is with diversity of thought. So why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you hire first for technical skills and then second for the diversity that that person brings to the team in terms of all those skills, as Kara said, the CQ and the EQ.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. And we'll be getting into those topics later on today as well, I'm sure. Callum.
Well, Helen's pretty much just given my answer, which is great because I don't need to speak as much. I wholeheartedly agree with what you said, Helen, about diversity of thought, and to get those different perspectives around the table and actually flesh those out as well. So I'm not going to repeat that. What I will say is that what we need to do in terms of the balance is having a recruitment system process that is designed for that role, rather than use that sort of vanilla approach to every single role. They actually target the skills, but the backgrounds, the experiences, and where those people are as well. So they actually get quite targeted in that. So it's fit for purpose rather than fit for replicating who we've already got. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I'll get into the specific questions, maybe answer this a bit more with that one.
I appreciate it, Callum. I know that we're moving fast, but time is tight, so thank you very much. So with that intro, Paul, what's your answer for this?
Well, firstly, I'd like to reassure the viewers that with all of my vigorous nodding, my head will stay in place. You know, I'm in such agreement with what everyone else has said. And I think there are a few points here, right? For me, one is we actually need an evidence-based approach for knowing what's predictive of future performance and contribution. Because at the moment, we have this false meritocracy, and this taps into what everyone else has said, where we go, if you've got a university degree, if you have a similar accent to me, if you have a similar background, then you're likely to perform well. Whereas actually none of those things directly relate to future performance or contribution in an organization. So I think part of the challenge for me is that we have the pretense of a meritocracy where we don't have a real one. We're just protecting sacred cows, and sacred cows that massively disadvantage people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Let me give you an example. I learned how to say 3 and pronounce my THs in my late 20s. Prior to that, I'd say 4 o'clock, you know, and that's more consistent with the sort of socioeconomic background I come from. Also as well, like I was commenting before we started around how envious I was of Callum wearing a t-shirt. I'm heavily tattooed, and I've had it so indoctrinated into me that I better not show those tattoos, or people are going to make judgments about me and my ability to operate professionally, that I better keep that stuff hidden. But those aren't relevant. Those are really not relevant to my ability to make a contribution. So those are a couple of things I'd say, but here's another one. We need to stop developing our leaders to know more stuff, to know more processes. And we need to start focusing more on developing their capacity to deal with complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty, and to navigate that environment. And that means being able to navigate those individual differences of people they deal with and get the most from them. So anyway, we'll get into it more later, but I'll carry on. And by the way, this is how you clap in sign language. So if you see me doing this, I'm getting amongst, okay?
Thanks, Wood. Thank you very much. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, great conversation. Look, I think to build on that fit for purpose comment from Callum, which I wholeheartedly believe in, I think we also need to mandate an approach which is strengths-based. It's not a deficit model. And I think to Callum's point as well, his introduction around the group that he's representing, I think a really important piece around selection methodologies that we need to make them accessible. These things can't prejudice because of colour blindness or even the ability to attend an interview because there's not wheelchair access. So I think we need to work with people's strengths. So that is a model and a philosophy that I think we need to buy into and mandate.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And it's a nice way to close out the general questions. What we're going to do now is move into specific questions for our panelists. Each panelist is going to be given 2 specific questions related to the interest group that they represent on the panel. We're going to kick off, again, if we can keep these moving, given that we've got 7 panelists all representing different interest groups. We're going to kick off firstly with you, Cara. So the first question we have for you, which will make a lot of relevance to our New Zealand viewers, not so much relevance to the rest. So I think that this will be a real interesting one. So some Pākehā may find it difficult to engage openly in a discussion about D&I related to Māori issues for fear of being deemed racially insensitive and not wanting to offend. What advice do you have for these people with these fears?
Great question. Not something new, actually. Firstly, let me define what Pākehā means to me. So if you break down the word Pākehā, Pā is a village or to touch something, Ke means different, and Ha means breath. So Pākehā is used to define someone or a group of people of a different breath. It dates to the time of British settlers and has become a common term associated to those of New Zealand European ethnicity. Let me give you a very quick history lesson. I don't know if the rest of the panel, they could probably add more to this. New Zealand is a small and young country in the Pacific Ocean. I think this year we reached a population count of 5 million. And it has quite a flavoursome history. Māori are the indigenous people of the land and migrated here from Hawaii. And some years later, around the 1800s, Māori were colonised by British settlers, and New Zealand became a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system of government. So there's a bit of history there going on. But back to your question, I can understand that feeling of fear. The fear of not wanting to offend and being deemed as offensive. What I can say is that this fear is shared, but just in a different way. I think if you flip the question to how Māori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, may find it challenging to have their culture and issues heard and acknowledged by those of little understanding or connection, at the fear of being ignored, labelled a minority, having to justify who they are, deemed as an activist or always sitting in their feelings. It's a really sad situation to be in, and so the fear is shared, but just in a different way around those conversations. Going back to kind of the crux of my understanding of diversity and inclusion, it comes down to respect and understanding. We have to find place and we have to find the people and allow spaces to have these conversations with each other in a safe way. Be respectful in approach, seek to understand and uplift, and then do something about it or carry on the conversation. Don't just stop there. Effort goes a long way, as does empathy and awareness. Most people, especially ones that I know, are open to a conversation when they feel the other person is genuine in their want to understand and are being respectful. Some people that I know are also happy to have the conversation when it's not. But there is the saying that I love. I tried to stay quiet, but my ancestors wouldn't let me. And I would rather people ask the question than sit in fear, worry, and confusion. I would suggest that they choose their words carefully. But if it is really a controversial question or comment, that they find someone that they feel comfortable and safe to have that discussion with. And my door's always open. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. Yeah, in short, that's kind of my answer to that.
Fantastic. And I couldn't agree more in terms of just the education around the long history of New Zealand and being able to engage in that is a very, very strong starting point. And I think that I could see Helen taking some notes as she was picking up some ideas, and I can see her using some of that, and it's fantastic. Good. Okay, so question 2. New Zealand is seen as a world leader in its dealings with Indigenous issues, and is often the poster child globally when discussing such matters. What would you say to people, and I'm meaning primarily New Zealanders, that might suggest that there is no need for a specific policy for Māori in this regard, and any discussion of such is just divisive?
Have you heard of that saying, internationally hot, locally not? There is definitely a growing appreciation of Māori culture in New Zealand and pockets of greatness at the moment. We have big communication companies partnering with tribes and promoting the use of Māori language, food produce organisations committing to greater leadership, representation of Māori by 2025. We have a female Māori moko kauai wearing Minister of Foreign Affairs. What was once the Vodafone New Zealand Music Awards is now named Aotearoa Music Awards, with many artists singing in Māori and greater representation of Māori too. Sports people in the debriefs, they're speaking in their own language. All TV channels have definitely increased their level of Māori language. Keyboard warriors making derogatory or racist comments being stood up to by the many, not just Māori. It's cool to be Māori and culturally intelligent, which once wasn't the case. And all that I've just spoken about has only occurred over the last few years, couple of years, and on the back of some strong people that took a stand, coupled with enabling support by others and the strength of the fight by generations before us. However, it has been, and it still is, a struggle and a half. There are still many people and systems in New Zealand who don't appreciate Māori culture and its language, kind of like what Dr. Paul Wood talked about, you know, bringing in someone to do the karakia or sing a song and then push them out the door while the meeting carries on. But so colonisation is very real in New Zealand, as is racism and bias. This generation is still experiencing it and feeling the intergenerational effects of it, and likely the next one or two will too. There is still a lot that needs to be done to address years of suppression, oppression, and inequity. It wasn't a million years ago. It was really recent. My grandfather's generation was part of those that were beaten for speaking their language and gave expression to their culture in schools. This in turn impacted on my father's generation, where many were not taught their language at the pure fear from their parents of people abusing their children. And of course, the education system still stifled in its Western design. Despite this, our parents and generations before them still fought for our language, identity, and culture to be acknowledged as treasures, of which we have every right of access to express and be unapologetically Māori. My generation are seen as the resurgence, but because of them, our parents and our generation, we have the right to education, which resonates with who we are through our own language and our own knowledge systems steeped in cultural intelligence. Māori are very resilient people. Ashley talked about Aboriginal people being resilient, as is Māori. And a lot of what has been successful for Māori was designed, developed, and delivered by Māori. However, one defining characteristic of historic and current public policy is the failure to improve outcomes for and lift the well-being of Māori. We continue to be overrepresented in justice, health, and welfare statistics. We are constantly having to justify the value and investment of our culture. We're asked to fit a template not suited to us, not created with us or for us. It gives more rise to engage and partner and incorporate Māori worldviews into our organisations. There's heaps of opportunities there. I celebrate all Indigenous people across the world. We're creating more opportunities to share knowledge and learn from each other, to also empower and support each other. I recently attended a Native American and Indigenous Studies Association conference in New Zealand. It was inspiring, fulfilling, and motivating. One of the lectures was titled, "Oh, but you don't look Māori," or "Oh, I don't look Māori." And I'd never seen so many fair-skinned Māori and Indigenous people across the world in one room. We discussed the power of an outsider's perspective of being Māori and the impact on one's cultural identity and confidence. And at the end of it, we all talked about how we need to embrace, celebrate diversity and indigeneity. But there's one person I would like to quote, and that's Dr. Rangi Maltamwa, who is an associate professor and Māori astronomist. And he said, "Knowledge that is not shared is not knowledge." There is a difference between sharing a culture and practicing a culture. If you want to study a culture, go to the museum, but it lives through practice. So in response to those that say we don't need specific policies or for Māori or for other Indigenous people, walk amongst us. Come to these conferences. Read a bit more on our history first, and I think you'll change your tune.
Well spoken, Cara. Well spoken, and you're absolutely right. This is a time and place where every generation who's alive now has a role to play, and they play it in their own way. And I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for agreeing to be part of this panel and speaking so well on this topic. By the way, I saw you like the Vodafone link up, and I don't know whether you know that 2 Degrees has done that up in Nepe-Apatu. And so it's all go. It's all go. Thank you very, very much. So now, who's our next speaker? Next up is Paul, Dr. Paul Wood. So Paul, the 2 questions that I have for you. Firstly,
can I just say yes, that is a Photoshopped photo. I admit that. If that was your first question. I know, that's why I hate this, because you look at that and then you look at this. And you're like...
Yeah, no, we grabbed our photos where we could. We grabbed them where we could. So I'll give you both questions and you can answer both of them at once. So the first question is, issues of social class are not often brought up in a New Zealand context when discussing diversity and inclusion. Why, therefore, do you think this is even relevant? And the second question is, given New Zealand's free education system, everyone has an equal opportunity to move between their class. So why should those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or economically disadvantaged through, say, a prison sentence, be given special treatment?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things here, and it's interesting following you, Cara, here, because when you were talking, I was thinking about how, of course, like Māori, for example, in New Zealand, are massively disproportionately represented in the lower socioeconomic background. And I think the part of the problem with that is we have this tendency to assume that people's position in life is something about them and something that's different to us when we experience good fortune. And so in many respects, we mistake the poverty issue in New Zealand for a cultural issue or a diversity issue in that respect. I think that's one of the things that causes a barrier for us, actually. We go, oh, this is a Māori problem, or this is a Pacific Island problem, rather than going, there's an impoverishment problem here. And it's not a level playing field. I mean, like the whole idea that our education system is equal in New Zealand and that you can rise up through the classes is a ridiculous notion. It really is. You know, right from the outset, everything is against you if you grow up in a lower socioeconomic area. You know, you're gonna less likely that you're gonna get the food you need. You know, in New Zealand, and we are a fantastically privileged country compared to many, but in New Zealand, if you come from a lower socioeconomic background, you know, the chances are, statistically, is that you will come from a family that is not always able to provide food, that is not always able to put food on the table, and the food that is put on the table will be a lower quality. You're more likely to be exposed to alcohol, drugs, tobacco, crime. You're also more likely to experience lower expectations of you in the classroom. And we know from all of the research in this area that teacher expectations make a massive difference in terms of educational achievement and outcome. You're also more likely to come from an environment where university attendance isn't even on your radar. It's not even seen as an option available to you. You know, I used to really get annoyed by this when I was in prison, and I would hear people talk about how the people in prison have made a choice to be there. They've had the same choices as everyone. You know, let me give you a standard example of the type of people I was in prison with. There'd be people who came from multi-generational crime families, who as soon as they're about 4 or 5 are getting put through windows by their elder siblings so that they can go and unlock the doors for burglaries, and who come from these crime families where prison's just seen as a rite of passage, not something to be embarrassed about. It's just what you do when you get to a certain age. And you're telling me that those people had an equal opportunity and a perception of their options in order to make the same choices as the rest of us? It's absolutely ridiculous. It's not a level playing field. And that's why I think it's so important that we strive for equality of opportunity, that we make more of an effort to provide a pathway for those who haven't had the same start as those of us of greater fortune to actually be able to be contributing members of society. You know, I mean, for example, as I mentioned earlier, I was incredibly lucky that I had the chance to come from a supportive family. I had a father who paid for my education out of his pension and made other sacrifices like that, and who saw education as a positive thing. So when I was ready to change my life, I could. Most people in prison don't have those opportunities. And that's why it's so important that we, to follow Ashley's point, that we make every effort possible to intervene earlier before we're even in that situation, so people do see having a professional career, do see that as an opportunity and understand the path and get the encouragement. I mean, just in the same way as Google adopted the policy of deliberately shoulder tapping and nudging female programmers in order to get them to actually apply for roles because they were less likely to apply for them. And as soon as they started giving them a nudge, then they increased the diversity of gender amongst programmers, senior programmers. You know, we have the same opportunity with those from a lower socioeconomic background, where we can go, this is a path for you. Let's make you aware of this. Let's encourage this. And that's not detracting from the ability to make a contribution in a meritocratic way. Anyway, there you go. Rant over. I'll go back to nodding.
Brilliant, Paul. Brilliant. The intensity with which you talk reminds me of an event that I think we both remember. You know, and it's you know, it is that intensity channeled. You speak so well on this topic, and it's just brilliant. Thank you, my friend. Okay, who's next on up? Helen, you're the next person. So your 2 questions. the women's movement has been highly active since the 60s, championing the rights of women in the workplace. What do you say to people that deny there are any issues related to D&I as it relates to women? And the gender paradox indicates that the freer a country is, the less that women will go for STEM roles. Some research may be interpreted that given the choice, women may not be as interested in managerial positions as men, again noting group averages. So why are we pushing women into roles that they may not want?
Okay, so first question. So I don't think the women's movement has been active everywhere since the 1960s. I think we're probably talking about developed Western economies. I think less so in some places it's only just starting. So, but I get your point. So what I say to people is look at the data. Just look at the data. I mean, there are so many assumptions. I mean, what's fascinating about this conversation is that the intersectionality and everything I'm hearing from these very different, diversity dimensions is just so similar in, in what we're all sort of trying to change. Is that there are all these assumptions and opinions that are absolute bollocks. They're just based on nothing. They're just based on perceived wisdom without any evidence. So the stuff I hear all the time is, oh, we don't have more women in leadership because women have babies. I'm like, oh, okay. So I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I've ever met a woman who's had a baby that hasn't involved a man at some point, So, men have babies too. So, and it's like, yeah, but then women leave the workforce to look after babies. Well, that's not in most places we have the research. That's not what we see. Women might leave an organisation, but they're not leaving the workforce. They're leaving the workforce in the same amount of numbers as men are to take a parenting role. That women aren't ambitious. The research doesn't show that women are no less ambitious. That they lack confidence. The research shows that's rubbish as well. That they don't ask for pay rises and they don't ask for promotions. Rubbish. It's not true. That there is a lack of women. There just aren't enough. The one that I love the most is that it's a lag effect. We just need to wait. Yeah, we just need to wait because now that we're all sort of, aware of gender equality, it's just a matter of time now that those women will trickle through. Utter rubbish. We've been graduating women from universities in the same number, if not higher numbers as men, for the last sort of 20, 30 years. So all of this is just utter nonsense that isn't based on data, isn't based on evidence, is just assumptions. So what I say is, and I think it's probably the same for all of us, is you've got to go back to the data, like show me the evidence, show me the data that this is not a problem, and use the evidence-based research to debunk these, to really just bring facts. Let's bring facts to it. The number one tool we have is the facts, the data, the evidence. So that's what I say to number two. And then, right, Dr. Paul, you and I need to have a chat about this question. Are you ready? So talking about data and evidence, you're a scientist, I'm a lay person, don't have your qualifications. So tell me where the evidence is about us pushing women into roles. So where and how are we pushing women into STEM roles?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, it's a question to you. It's your question. So why are we pushing women into roles they may not want? So where and why and how are we pushing women into roles?
Fair call, fair call. So the question is there to cause debate. And
yes.
If anyone's ever seen Helen and I, which none of you have, seen Helen and I work these workshops together, what you're getting is a snapshot of exactly how it works. And it works very powerfully. So let's start with that gender paradox. So for those that don't know, it's a very famous paper. It's getting more famous, and we can send it to you if you'd like it, which has essentially maps out different countries where women are involved in STEM roles, and there's an inverse relationship between the freedom of that country and women going into STEM roles. So that research I can show you, likewise with the managerial. So the question is not so much that it's not that we are pushing, it's more that this is pushed as an argument against us, that there is actually an issue here. So what the question is really posing is people who would use this research as a way to support their bias, they would push that paper and they would be saying, look, there isn't a problem here. And so if I was to answer that, just to put it onto your point, I think it comes to the points that Cara and Paul have already raised around those role models. But that would be my answer. So, you know,
so yes, I mean, I'm being obviously, I'm just pushing your buttons for the sake of it because it's fun. But you know, so you know, I'm aware of the research, and I think it's really interesting. And my understanding, I mean, there's a couple of different research papers, so I'm not sure if we're talking about the same one, but the one that I'm quite familiar with is in those countries where there's higher GDP and the gender gap is less wide, the lower the gender gap. Women are less attracted to STEM roles than they are in those countries with lower GDP and a wider gender gap. And some of the hypotheses around why this is because for women from countries with lower wealth and lower support, those roles are the route to financial empowerment and financial equality. So the more attracted, you know, in Asia we call it the iron rice bowl. The more attracted to those professions because it's a more well-worn route to financial freedom, because those are the growing parts of the economy. And so that's why there's an attraction. And then in those more developed countries, the sort of theory goes, well, when all things become equal, and especially for those countries, most of those countries are welfare states, when women are left to their own devices, they're less attracted to those professions, which I think is really interesting. I don't think it's conclusive, I just think it's interesting. And what we know is that when it comes to things like maths and STEM subjects, at a very young age, girls are just as capable, slightly more capable than the boys. But when it comes to other subjects, they're more capable. So when it comes to things like reading and other skills, they're more capable. So it's interesting about how that dynamic might work when it comes, perhaps they have more choice when because they've got a broader skill set when it comes to choosing what they might want to do. And there's a couple of things within that's a bit, because they're asking people from adolescence all the way through to 90. So that's sort of cultural, like the intersectionality of income bracket and generation is not as nuanced as it could be in that data. But I think what I take for it is I don't think we're pushing women. We're not saying women should go into STEM, and I don't think I think what you're trying to suggest is this data shows that actually the barriers we think are there may not be there. Perhaps it's that women aren't interested rather than that there are barriers there. And I disagree with that. I come back to the other Dr. Paul's sort of view is that I think that's rubbish. I think what is happening in STEM is we are trying to remove barriers to give women an equal chance of being able to work, succeed and thrive in STEM roles. Why? Because those are for most, I think this is the fourth, we call it the fourth industrial revolution. These are the jobs of the future. That's where the economic and financial power will be. And if we're underrepresented there, then we'll continue to be underrepresented economically and financially, but also because that industry is building the solutions of tomorrow. And if we are not part of that design stage, if we're not designing the tools and the way that we're going to work and live in the future, then it's also not going to be equal. So just, there's lots of examples, but just one example is all this this movement in health monitoring, these fantastic technologies that help us constantly monitor our health. Most of them don't track menstrual cycle. Probably the most important thing for a woman to know in terms of her health is tracking her menstrual cycle. It's not in the design phase. Why? Because it's been designed by men and they don't have a cycle, to put it bluntly. So it's things like that we need to be at the table, whatever it is we're doing in terms of designing the future, whether it's politics, whether it's STEM, we need to be equally represented, because we're, without that, then these things aren't going to be fit for purpose for us. And so I think it's, for me, what this is about saying, there's this fantastic, the late great RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, "I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask is that our brethren take their foot off our neck." We just want an equal chance. And we know that there's systemic barriers in place, mainly driven out of unconscious bias, very similar to what I'm hearing about in terms of ethnicity, race, socioeconomic, neurodiversity. There are these baked-in biases that mean that there isn't equal choice. And so I just want, for my daughter, I want her to be able to pick what she wants to do, unencumbered by her gender. And if that's STEM, if it's not, that's great. But I at least want her to have an equal chance to pick whatever it is that she wants to do.
Fantastic.
And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Oh, it's brilliant. Well, this has been designed for everybody to talk from their soapbox, and you know, I just love the dialogue, and this is exactly what this is about. And I think that this is the style that is required to make these types of breakthroughs that we're doing. You know, I enjoy it when we do it in a workshop. I enjoy it in this forum, and I think that it is exactly what's required. Thank you so much. Thank you for your continued contribution, man. And I'd say thank you for being in Singapore. I appreciate it a lot. So, who is going to be next? Callum, you're up next. So here are your two questions. The world's not fair, and we simply need the person with the best abilities to perform in the job. This will mean that people with learning difficulties are unlikely to be a good fit. How would you respond to such a statement? And secondly, neurodiversity is a luxury, and I don't have the luxury of time to be able to consider this as part of my selection criteria. My job does not require creativity, and this is really of no concern of mine. How would you respond?
All right. Now, like Helen sort of pulled you up on, I guess, Paul, I get that you're trying to be controversial and stir up some debate because there's a little bit of offence that I've taken in that question, in that neurodiversity is about learning difficulties, when neurodiversity is actually about the difficulties with the environment that people are placed into, right? And including other people's expectations, the stigma, misunderstandings, etc. So what everybody here represents, neurodiverse people also, I guess, come up against. What we see is the struggle with neurodiverse people trying to fit into a world or a workplace, systems, processes that are not designed for them in mind, right? And so that's what we see when people are acting out or seem different, weird, not fitting, antisocial, whatever it is, right? So secondly, the assumption that I guess recruiting for fit, so in the question there is that people are unlikely to be a good fit. I think recruiting for fit is not a good option. It's an approach that hasn't necessarily worked, and it's got us into a lot of trouble. And yet we've tried to use, we need to recruit for fit for decades. And I think we kind of almost need to do away with that in some regards, or at least certainly define what fit is. Look at Enron, where everybody had to fit a certain mode. That didn't work out too well for them. Look at the aviation industry, legal, finance, the medical professions, where people have to fit a particular mode or know their place, right? And which means that they don't necessarily speak up or speak out when they notice things that need to be spoken about or need to be pulled up on, right? And so it's like the whistleblower is the outlier, and I think we need to flip that, and possibly workplaces should have more whistleblowers, right? So what I'd do is I'd push back on your question, and I would advise two things. First of all, I would question why we shape the job we do. So this first question is specifically about how do we recruit and select people, and if they're not going to fit, well, why do we shape the job the way we do? Are we expecting people to be too broad in their skill sets? Could we carve up the role so that we still have the same full-time equivalent number, same number of positions there, but perhaps we could make the role more targeted to some natural tendencies that people display. So stop advertising catch-all roles that require people to be team players, super social, collaborative, but also hyper focus on particular pieces of information or whatever. So some things that may actually be in conflict when you come down, when you're expecting out of a single person. Like we almost look for superhumans, which kind of gets me onto the next point, is that why don't we seek out people that are a little different, right? I'm not really all that interested in what people look like, but I'm interested in what maybe how people can tackle problems. So if they come about problems that are a bit differently, they ask questions that people are are afraid to ask. Do they look at, do they pull threads different ideas together in ways that other people can't, and that could create a solution for us there. So I think neurodiversity or neurodiverse people have difficulties in the system. So we talk about they may not fit or be a good fit. People with learning difficulties is in your question, Paul, but I think we also need to appreciate that while we might have those difficulties, the flip side of that is that there are some gifts, some talents, maybe even some superpowers, if you like, that we could harness as well. So while someone may struggle socially, they may be really, really, really good at pulling ideas together. While someone may struggle to read or spell, they may be incredibly deeply empathetic and be able to connect with people. And so you have those people to bring teams together, right? So that's my answer for your first question. The second question, the line that's offensive in there, Paul, is that neurodiversity is a luxury. It's not a luxury because neurodiverse people are everywhere. You don't need to have too big an organization to have at least some of that workforce being neurodiverse. So we're talking people with ADHD, dyslexia, maybe on the autism spectrum, and a few other things in there. Close to sort of, and it's a catch-all as well. So neurodiversity is a really broad category, and none of those, none of the what we call disorders, unfortunately, or categories in there are the same. Well, it's very, very broad, which means that up to 20% of a workforce could be neurodiverse in some way. So my point there is you already have neurodiverse people. And so if you don't have, you know, if you don't consider this to be part of your workforce, well, it's actually your job as a leader to bring out the best in people. And so how about flipping from the perspective that neurodiversity is a luxury to actually we might have some different thinkers and people who are struggling with the way we manage and design work and them as a person. So how do we harness those people? Your job as a leader is to bring out the best in those people. Plus, if they're already in your workforce, you're paying them 100% of their salary. So why don't we try to get 100% out of them? People who are neurodiverse tend to hide. They cap their own potential. If they don't fit, they don't necessarily put their hands up for extra things, right? And so how do we help those people fit? And if they're only giving 80% where we're paying them 100%, that makes no sense from a business perspective. So how about we try to get the most out of them by asking those people, in fact, all people, what do they need? How can we make your experience of work a wee bit easier? That seems like the thing to do, rather than say, well, neurodiversity is a luxury, I don't have time, etc. You probably get to know your workforce, and you'll find that you've got different thinkers right throughout it. Here we go. There's my two answers.
That is absolutely fantastic. A couple of points I really want to reinforce in terms of what you've spoken about is this idea that these concepts are not categories. This is a spectrum, and from a psychological perspective, that's what we know, and that spectrum is broad. And understanding that, and understanding where I fit on that spectrum, and how I have moved through, and I'm talking personally, from an education system that was generous to me to facilitate that learning through. I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't. And I think that what you're talking about in terms of the environmental changes, as opposed to the focus on the individual and flipping that around, is incredibly powerful. And I think those 2 points are really, really powerful. And the point I think that you make, and I want to pick up on this as well in terms of what Helen spoke about, which is that we can get research, but it's not till we dig deeper into that research that we start to see the flaws in it. And we certainly understand that from our perspective. And that, I think, is what's really required. And often the stuff is just used out of context. And I think the way that you describe that in terms of the diversity of teams and the way that diverse teams and what they really bring to the table, is very powerful. So some real good take-home points. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay, who is up?
Okay, I'll unmute myself. Love the passion of these discussions, I have to say.
Just
So,
for those, you can read it straight away?
yep,
Good on you.
all good. I'll just launch into it, shall I? Okay, cool. So the question is, how have we used the lessons from post-apartheid around diversity and inclusion? I think the first thing is that it is a country that had institutionalized and legalized segregation and racism. And to move from that to non-racialism or a rainbow nation, and has made huge progress, but also some challenges along the way. I think there's some lessons learned in the things that worked and didn't work. So I'm just going to share with you today my sense of what that was, okay? The first thing I think is that it was really effective as a country in opening the dialogue around race and having those conversations. And those conversations have made it a level of ease to talk about power and privilege and restitution and prejudice and restoration and reconciliation. It allowed people to use it and talk about it in a very open way. And I think that was the biggest learning. And I have to say, you can't take that for granted, because if I look at the rest of the world, it's not an easy feat to be able to have those conversations and the ease of those dialogues. The second thing about it is that I think South Africa really challenged the melting pot as a flawed mental model. And I feel really strongly about this, because what it did was it assumed that inclusion was about a melting pot. But inherent in that is the idea that there is a single social and cultural product. And if you really examine that, it's often linked to the majority values and the majority goals. And so we're saying we want you to conform to this melting pot that's the dominant viewpoint, okay? So rather than take on the concept of melting pot, we talk about a patchwork. And I don't particularly like the patchwork analogy. I actually prefer what's called from a melting pot to a fruit salad approach of looking at it, because everyone retains their identity but infuses their flavor into the mix. And I think that's a much better way, because then we're preserving and capitalizing on the strengths of people. So for me, that's my take on one of the first lessons learned, is that how do we do that? The second lesson learned for me is around the power of discourse and association. So when I think about in South Africa, we renamed things. And what was the reason of having language and renaming things? I think it's so important because discourse affects thinking. And unless we have language that is representative of people, we're going to absolutely affect thinking in the space. And I think South Africa, the one value we had, we went from having no conversations and restricted conversations about race to it people feeling much more comfortable having ongoing and uncomfortable conversations about race, having more conversations, deeper conversation, non-PC conversations. And I think that that meant that we're having more courageous conversations. I think that is something that in South Africa is taken for granted, but I look at the rest of the world and I realize that's not a normal feat, okay? And it's definitely a lesson that they could be pulling from that. The other point I think is the diversity and inclusion piece, that the two have to go together. I think we give people the room. A lesson learned is that we give them the space in the room, but we don't give them the space for their thoughts and their way of life. So it's a bit like asking people, inviting them to a ball, but not inviting them to dance. You can't have diversity without inclusion, okay? So for me, that you got to have two pieces of the puzzle. The third concept I think that's made a difference is talking about representation of diversity and exposure. What happened was we went from Group Areas Act to being more exposed to people and having a greater appreciation for people as opposed to a category of race. And I think that that made a big difference. The second difference was in having diversity programs run by diverse multicultural group, not the dominant narrative. And I think that's really important because I often find that when you go to diversity programs, people always say, let's have the real conversation after this program. And I call it the after conversations that occur. And what happens is that I think that by having people that are more representative of the diverse group, you got more chance of having the real conversations in the room as opposed to waiting for an after session. And I had that experience when I went to the IO Psych conference, and everyone said, wait till the session's over, we'll have the real conversations then. So I think that's important, the importance of voice, but also giving people an alternate role models. You can never underestimate that we've been dominated by dominant role models, and having people of diverse groups gives people an alternative role model. And I think that's really important. I also think the lessons learned were around systems and policy not just being enough. And one example I can think of is that, South Africa had equity committees. But what happened was they were not supposed to just look at quotas. They were supposed to look at removing barriers. And what occurred was that they constituted the groups, but what happened was they weren't representative of the whole organization, and they had entry-level staff who didn't have decision-making powers. So that's my point about not just having a system, but having a system that actually enables a true voice and representation of people. And also, I think what you couldn't underestimate is the entrenched propaganda and dominance of stereotypes and inferiority around stereotypes. And I think what happened was that even if you bring people into the mix and have representation, you can't fight the entrenched inferiority messages that have been conveyed to them for decades. And it's something that you actively have to work on. And I think that's key, because Harvard, there was a study where they put Black panelists on interviews and said, we're going to have a much more representative panel. But what happened was they were selecting the white applicants because of that influence of that dominant messaging. So that's quite interesting, that it's just not system, but it has to be mindset change and culture change as well. I also think South Africa was good because what they talked about was legal and accountability reporting. So all enterprises had to start to report on being able to, and not just a compliance measure, but really reporting on differences they were making. And I think one of the other things is that restorative healing. South Africa was great in terms of having the process of restorative healing, but it wasn't enough. It needed to have economic restoration, and it needed to have restorative justice. It needed other pieces of work for long-term changes. And I think that's the next piece of work that needs to happen. The next piece of work is around managing the challenges on individualism and collectivism, which in Zulu we talk about Ubuntu, is that collective consciousness, if you like. I think that's a challenge of people fighting that, and it could actually be quite divisive for people. And then definitely working on the diversity and inclusion piece. So yeah, that's the first question. And the tricky second question. So the tricky second question is really about affirmative action and why are people so against it. I think people think of affirmative action as the euphemism for reverse discrimination. So, and take offense to it. And often they will say things like, oh, well, we are all equal under the law. But I think we need to remember that society doesn't just transform the moment a law is enacted, and you can't hang your hat on it, right? So the other thing that, and I think Paul Wood talked about, he talked about the equality of opportunity. I think it's important to think of two things when you're talking about affirmative action: the equality of outcomes and the equality of opportunities. And often people focus on one of them, but not both of them. And so they try to get one, but they don't get the other. And when you're talking about affirmative action, both pieces have to be a part of the puzzle. The next thing I think in terms of social science and organizational behavior, we talk about procedural justice and we talk about distributive justice. For the people who are against affirmative action, they tend to focus on procedural justice, but they forget about the distributive justice. And that's important that in the organizations we have both components of that. I think people also for affirmative action need to realize the impact of a shackles generation, that people carry the generation of disadvantage through each generation, so that it's just not played out that in my generation, we have given you an equal chance, okay? I think the other key point that I want to say is that this concept of this just world phenomenon, which is actually really a toxic belief that we pass on through generations. And it's that you get what you deserve. And also that people should be able to speak up for themselves. There's some wonderful research that says that people don't actually realize they're being discriminated against. It's only when it's really severe that they realize that. So they're not going to speak up for themselves. And the other thing as well is the almost horrific belief that minority groups living in poverty didn't work hard enough, and so it's they're failing because they didn't work hard enough. And the greatest concern is that there's so many causes for that. There's not just a single cause. Much more impactful is what I'm fearful of, is that self-fulfilling prophecy around some of these discussion and discourses, and the belief that people start to blame themselves and the families for situations that's out of their control. So I think we need to acknowledge from an affirmative action perspective that we're working with the disproportionate playing field. We'd like to assume that all things are equal. We'd like to assume that we're in the same race together. Some people haven't even been in the race, let alone being at the same starting point, you know. So we have to start acknowledging that there's very different sense of our concept of privilege, and I call it the Weet-Bix phenomenon. Life is very different from someone who's assured of their 2 Weet-Bix in the morning than for someone who's not. And they have a different reality or sense of reality and experience. So I think you can only walk in someone's shoes to truly understand that. So the debate will go on, but I think that it is unfinished business, especially around affirmative action.
Fantastic, Vino. That was just brilliant. And I find affirmative action to be a very interesting topic. Helen and I discuss this a lot, and I think in the opposite way that many may think. And I think that it's a very powerful topic now. And I think that the discussion and debates that are going on in the States with the Black Lives Matter movement have brought that to a head. A book that I would really strongly recommend everybody have a read of is The Tyranny of Merit. I think it's incredibly powerful for understanding this debate. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That brings us to Ashley. So Ashley, here are your 2 questions. What do you see as the unique issues that need to be addressed in an Australian context to create a greater level of diversity and inclusion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia? And secondly, for people that might say that this is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander issue to solve and not something that I need to be concerned or involved in, how would you respond to that sentiment?
Okay, well, I'll be quick because some of it's been said, but I love listening to Cara. You can come over here and teach cultural awareness training with me because we speak very similar. For me, just quickly, I was 2 years away from being born as flora and fauna. So when you talk about a nation, we're actually still very young. We weren't Australian citizens, obviously, till the referendum in '67. So, you know, a lot of my people, my family, my uncles, my aunties, everyone weren't even classified as Australian citizens, you know, and they've got children here. So when you talk about Gen Y, Gen X, we're actually quite young. You know, we've survived I believe the termination policy, the segregation policy, and all the rest, the assimilation and all the like. So for me, you know, the main things that come to mind is a treaty, which we missed out on. I think the Maoris were much bigger people and they wanted to talk to them. They didn't want to talk to us. I think we were more skinny in nature and physically smaller. So maybe, I don't know why we didn't get the treaty, but well, that's another story. And there's little things around the anthem and recognising Aboriginal people as the First Nations people in this country, putting us in the Constitution, giving us a voice in Parliament. You know, there's a lot more for us to be done from a leadership perspective. But I think I'm going to make a general statement. I don't think Australia really knows itself. Like, I always put this analogy out there. If someone from Mars landed here and said to the average Australian, "What's your culture? You know, what is culture about?" What do you think the Australians would say? You know, I'd hope they wouldn't say, "Oh, having a barbecue, having a punt, going to footy." You know, I think culture and identity needs to be taught from an early age for everyone. You know, it's not just an Indigenous thing. So I think culture being taught across the board to understand. I think people who come into this country have more understanding of Aboriginal people than people who are born here. So, you know, they bring cultural values and insight into, you know, and they understand the journeys and maybe the challenges we face. So I think Australia itself may need to find its identity, and in many ways we do, but in many ways we don't, particularly when it's talking about understanding the First Nations people. But for me, in closing, I think it's about Australia. For us to move forward, we need to work together. You know, we need to fight this challenge and these battles unified. I think everybody needs to come together to walk and fight this battle. It's not an Aboriginal specific issue now. You know what I mean? We've got to do this as one, and we've got to do this collectively. And yeah, I don't think it's an issue on its own. So yeah, for me, it's a unified nation is a strong nation. We should be segregating all of our policies and just basically saying, Aboriginal people, you fix that issue. Because at the end of the day, I think non-Aboriginal people should know our issues and our struggles as much as anybody else. So it's everybody's issue if we're going to live here together.
Fantastic, Ash. I think again, it's so well expressed. It is our issues, and it's our issues because we all live here together. It's a quote for it really does capture the entire panel in one sentence. So thank you very much. Okay, and just to close out, Ben. So your two questions. I think I'll take Vino's advice and just let you read those, seeing time is tight. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Thanks, Paul. Look, I would also like to just acknowledge off the back of Ash's response there, that particularly Ash has been an amazing mentor for me personally to be able to understand Aboriginal cultural issues over the past 15 to 20 years that I've known Ash. So thank you for taking me on that journey and supporting me, Ash. Look, the role of a psychologist, I think, is really quite clear when it comes to some of these issues. I don't think the answers are that clear, but the role of a psychologist, I think, is. I think we take the lens that it needs to be researched, it needs to be evidence-based. We do need to understand key code of ethics, and as a psychologist, the number one thing that we have to sign up to and sign off on regularly is code of ethics. And this is not something that is black or white. This is something that ensures that we are really cognizant of these issues. So the question around stopping these things from happening, I don't think we can. I'd love it if we could in some areas, but it's really taking that approach around psychological safety. It's understanding risk. It's ensuring that we are, to Callum's term earlier, we are using things that are valid, assessments that are validated, that are fit for purpose. We do know that people do score differently on different assessments. Women generally score higher on agreeableness, on personality assessments. We do know that younger men will score higher on gamified assessments. We do know that cognitive reasoning assessments are highly influenced by education and exposure. So if 1.7% of all students in Australia are Indigenous, how can we have a merit-based system where we can hope for diversity and inclusion? So we really need to understand that we have a major role to play in educating our clients, ensuring that we are held to those sort of really high standards and understand risk, psychological safety, and underpinned by these really cool codes. The second question looks at, I guess, a really interesting one around assessments of implicit bias. So assessments that are looking at things around our attitudes towards gender, our attitudes towards racism. The research is quite poor in that these assessments don't necessarily correlate that well or predict behaviour. So my take on that, and not to take up too much more time, is that let's focus less on the assessments. Let's focus more on the application. And as a proud applied psychologist, I think it's less about the tokenistic. It's far more about systemic and behavioural cultural change. So let's not tick the box. Let's not just do a cultural awareness 1 hour workshop. Let's shift it to Ash's point. Let's bring it early on. Let's educate and look at wholesale change. Thanks, Paul.
Ben, and I appreciate you doing that so succinctly. And I think the point that you raised with Ash is really powerful, because obviously OPRA's a tight-knit group, and we learn from your experiences. And so those influences that Ashley has on you, they then have an influence on myself, you know, not being from Australia, not knowing the issues as well as I will the issues in New Zealand. So, you know, I appreciate that. And so look, we do have some very quick fire questions. So these have to be quick fire. These are going to be 30-second, just around the room. So what 3 things would you like to see introduced to workplace legislation to ensure greater diversity and inclusion? 3 things. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Wood. 3 things very quickly, and then we just go around everyone.
Incentives for organizations to actually follow legitimate performance prediction in terms of their hiring, incentivizing that. Also incentivizing internships where organizations proactively go out and seek to provide people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and prisoners with opportunities for internships in their organizations. I'm involved in some of that right now, and it is the way to go. So there you go. I'm just going to ask for 2 things. I'm not greedy.
Very good, very good. Vino. You got your mic?
So I lost 10 seconds by unmuting myself. Okay, so I say values and principles. If we could include goodwill encapsulated in law, why not consider values and principles? Okay, I would say the other thing is about protecting people's civil rights, but also the behavioral indicators around that. The difference between hate speech and freedom of speech. You know, there's the behavioral component around that as well, and definitely in terms of continuing our work on adverse impacts. I think there's a whole body of work of people who are well-intentioned but are not aware of the level of implicit biases that are occurring and the adverse impacts. So really putting that on the agenda as well. I'm done.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Cara.
From a Māori perspective, I'd say similar to Vino and Paul, setting an expectation for all staff on an effective level of cultural intelligence, particularly around the Treaty of Waitangi, a strong retention plan for Māori staff so that their knowledge is nurtured and grown well-being at the agency. There's a lot of taking, not a lot of giving, and more Māori representation in leadership.
Perfect. Thank you. Ashley?
Didn't mute myself. Organisational culture, obviously we really define that and see what our true values really are. But I don't like the term cultural competency being thrown around too loosely. So cultural awareness is a foundation at the beginning. You know, gaining knowledge is a part of that foundation. But for me, then it's all about, you know, people can do it and do the awareness, do the programs and the courses, but they don't have an appreciation. They don't have the respect. So there's a personal element that goes with cultural competency, and then you got to live and breathe it. You got to walk it and talk it. So obviously experience and those relationships with, you know, all the disadvantage and all the groups we're talking about. I just feel cultural competency thrown out too loosely.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashley. Helen, 3 things.
I've got 2. They're not specific to gender. I think they work for pretty much everything we've talked about. Proven policies where we've got stuff that we know that it works and it will work for all diversity dimensions, that it should be mandated that people just have to do them. Why wouldn't you? Doesn't make any sense. And the second is, because you and I don't agree on affirmative action, because I'm still not convinced, the sort of the lower version of that, reporting on data, I think it should be mandated that companies should track data, workplace data, and have to report on it in a public way. Because we know that when people have to report on things, it forces them to look at it a little bit more carefully and to give it more focus.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much. Callum.
Look, I'm not going to take up any more points. I think everybody's raised them, and they do work across neurodiversity as well. The thing is, neurodiversity is really broad, right? Because everybody has a brain. Some people's brains are just wired a wee bit differently. So I reckon if we have a willingness at executive levels to role model a desire to have greater understanding of where people come from, what they're about, and to a willingness for people to show up who they are at all levels of the organization. Because if you look at autism is very different from ADHD, which is very different from dyslexia, and even within those categories, people experience those very, very differently. So people don't experience ADHD the same way as somebody else with ADHD, right? It's quite different. And so we need, as a result of that, people hide at work. So let's break down those barriers so people don't have to hide and actually have the true person turn up. I think your question talks about legislation, and that's tricky, and you can't really legislate for neurodiversity. Possibly the most effective thing to do would be to look at neurodiversity as a disability, which it is not. It is not a disability at all. However, the processes, the mechanisms, even the constructs, the frameworks we use to govern our organisations they actually disable neurodiverse people. So perhaps we need to look at that. And I think that's probably a further conversation that needs to be had. That's my time.
Thank you, Callum. And I'm sure there's going to be more conversations for sure after this. Ben, 3 things very quickly.
Just to add on to everyone else's, I like the idea Paul Wood suggested around incentivising, like global quality standards. I'd like to see more standards. I'd like to see benchmarks, and I'd like us to strive, maybe not be legislated, but actually strive to meet these sort of national standards around accessibility, around inclusion, around diversity. So let's raise the bar formally.
Fantastic, Ben. And now look, last question. We won't have Q&A, but one last question. If you were to design an educational, if it was a billboard, you're designing an educational promotional campaign, unlimited budget. Give us in 20 seconds or less the message you'd want to get out to the public. Paul Wood?
We don't get to choose where we start, but as a society, we get to choose the opportunities we provide. There you go, might be an option for me in marketing. And the second one would be, there has to be a path back. If there's not a path back, there's no way forward. And that relates to imprisonment, that relates to criminality. You know, we have to have a path back into society where we accept people, give them a chance to make meaningful contributions, because if not, there's no way forward. All right, boom, done.
Thank you. Cara, what would you want in an educational promo campaign?
3 quick slogans. If it's about us or for us, do it with us. There's so much unlearning to be done in order to move forward. And we are the change agents of now, our culture, our foundation, our future.
Thank you so much. Yeah, big high fives. Ashley, what would you want in an educational promotional campaign?
Oh, I just saw unlimited budget, so I just wanted to find an Indigenous Donald Trump. So, we're just going to find, yeah. So I just saw that now, but besides that, besides the leader of influence, I just think Australia needs to be proud of, you know, the oldest living culture on it. You know, it's here in their backyard, and they don't realise it. So to me, it's about recognising the strengths and the qualities of this culture and be proud of it. That it's not. It's like they think we need something or we want something, you know, that you can grab and hold. It's not that. It's really just, it's in their hearts. It's just empathy and understanding. There's knowledge. It's acceptance. It's appreciation. So for me, I think we're losing the opportunity to walk together by being proud of the oldest living culture in our own backyards, but we're not seeing it.
Well spoken. Thank you very much. Helen, very quickly, your educational promotional campaign, unlimited budget.
I don't have a slogan. It was a very long-winded reply because I worked in marketing and communication for 25 years. So of course, I couldn't possibly give you a simple answer. But it would be, in essence, it'd be about creating a soap opera which signaled new social norms, because research shows that we don't have to change people's values. Sometimes we can just show them new norms, and if they recognize that's how we should behave, they'll change their behavior to follow those social norms, and then their values will catch up later. It's work that was done in post-genocide Rwanda, which was really interesting. So it would be a whole soap opera which showed more healthy models of how we want the genders to live their lives. There you go.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. Ben?
Yeah, back to my 7-year-old daughter. She loves acrostic poems. So I went with LIVE, which is LGBTI. It's I for Indigenous, it's V for variety and versatility, and its E for embrace change. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Callum?
A nice build into this, because like Ashley and Helen, I also saw the unlimited budget, and so it's not billboard, it's not even a soap opera. So I reckon what we do is create an alternative production company to Netflix, and we would call it Neuroflix. And so that showcases the gifts, the talents, the superpowers of neurodiverse people, like we're talking a whole production company here. So and we're showcasing the goodness that people can bring, because I think we need to reframe and reimagine and even probably re-educate the stereotypes, the stigma, the perception that people have around neurodiversity, which have been formed by really bad portrayals of people with neurodiverse characteristics in movies. Like when I say autism, people think of Rain Man, which is the worst example and possibly the most extreme, but the least common display of autistic tendencies, right? Think of dyslexia, you think of learning disabilities, which in your question, Paul, it's not necessarily that, right? So I reckon we reframe that with a whole lot of brilliant shows and movies, etc. And flip the script and the whole campaign so that neurodiversity is seen for the gifts and the superpowers rather than the deficits, so that neurotypical people, the majority, the middle of the bell curve, eventually really actually want to be neurodiverse themselves. Because what I find really interesting is that we hold up business leaders as the people we hold up, the business leaders, sorry, that we hold up as the gurus are actually neurodiverse themselves, all the way from Einstein through to Bill Gates, Richard Branson. They've all got brains that are wired differently, and we hold them up really high, and yet the conditions that they have are termed as negative, and yet they've got to where they are because they think differently, they've come about things differently. So massive production companies showcasing all that, it'll be huge. Like, we're talking massive, and on the internet.
I love it, Callum, and I think it's not even about the middle curve wanting understanding it. I think it's them understanding as well that we are all neurodiverse, and that is the whole point. And I think that you made that really, really well. Vino, just to close us out, your billboard, your campaign, Unlimited.
I would end with a challenge and hope. My challenge is that the way we deal with the spectrum of diversity, it's this progressive, bite-sized approach. And while we're working in this bite-sized approach, we tell people, you wait in line, we'll get to you sometime, okay? So rather, if I had unlimited budget, let's look at the whole spectrum of diversity, disability, the whole spectrum, rather than doing the work that we're doing in diversity inclusion in this bite-sized modular way that we're doing it with, right? Which is more divisive. The second thing is around hope. For me, it's a Nelson Mandela quote. He said, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin, their background, or their religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, because love comes more naturally to the human art than its opposite.
Wow. What a place to finish. What a place to finish. Well, thank you for sharing your love today. Thank you for being able to be part of this. And, I really appreciate you to use a Kiwi term, keeping it so real. And keep it real is what we do. And there's an international audience watching this. I truly appreciate the input that you've had. I appreciate you as people, the things that you stand for, the work that you do. The world needs it, and you're driving it. And I appreciate you one and all. So thank you. That is us. We managed to get it in 2 hours, and for those of you that it's your lunchtime like me, enjoy the rest of your day. For those of you that have given up your evening, thank you. And yeah, all I can say is, once again, thanks. See you later, everybody.